The battlefield was silent, but the echoes of war still screamed in the air. Commander Darius Voss stood tall, his armor battered but strong, the weight of 1,000 battles on his shoulders. His team of elite soldiers was with him, pushing through the alien territory of the Xalketh, a ruthless race bent on conquering the galaxy. He had led them through countless fights, their victories piling up like medals, each one a testament to his skill and leadership. Today, however, it wasn't just another fight. The Xalketh had unleashed something new, something dangerous. It was an attack unlike any other, a bioweapon designed to break down not just the body but the mind. Darius had been leading the charge when it happened. The ground beneath them trembled as the explosion ripped through the air, sending a wave of toxic gas into their ranks. His helmet cracked, the air inside turning thick with smoke. His vision blurred. For a moment, the world spun. "Voss, get down," someone shouted, but the voice was distant, muffled. Darius tried to focus. He reached for his weapon, but his hand felt heavy, his thoughts sluggish. Everything around him became a blur, as if the world itself was slowly being erased. His mind was no longer his own. The last thing he remembered before everything went black was the image of his team charging forward into the haze, ready to face whatever danger came next. Then, the darkness took over. When Darius awoke, it was not to the sound of gunfire or the screams of war. It was quiet. Too quiet. He sat up, disoriented, his head pounding. His helmet was gone, and his armor, though still intact, was covered in dirt and ash. He was lying in the middle of what used to be a battlefield, now just a wasteland. The distant remnants of fires smoldered around him, but everything felt eerily calm. Darius stumbled to his feet, his legs shaky, as though he had been asleep for a lifetime. He scanned his surroundings, but the landscape was unrecognizable. The once vibrant terrain had been turned into a graveyard of twisted metal and ruined structures. The war was over, but there was no sign of life, human or alien. His mind was a void. He couldn't remember what had happened or why he was here. His name, his past, his purpose, nothing. All he knew was one thing: he was alone. Darius took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. His suit's HUD flickered to life, showing basic readings, his vitals, his location, and the status of his gear. The familiar interface comforted him for a brief moment, but it didn't answer the questions that gnawed at his mind. Where was everyone? What had happened to his team? Why couldn't he remember? The suit's AI, Echo 9, suddenly spoke, its voice calm but distant, as if it had been waiting for him to wake up. "Commander Voss, are you all right?" Darius's heart skipped a beat at the sound of his name. Commander Voss. It felt familiar, but it didn't feel like him. Who was Commander Voss? Who was he? I don't know," he muttered, his voice rough. He looked down at his hands, his fingers trembling. The only thing he could feel was the cold, metallic grip of his weapon. It was like an extension of his body, something that had always been with him. But why? "Commander, your mission has been marked as complete." Echo 9 continued, the calm voice offering no comfort. "Your team has completed their objective. All targets neutralized. You are the last survivor." The last survivor. Darius clenched his fists. The words hit him harder than he expected. Survivor of what? What was the objective? Why did he feel empty? A flash of pain shot through his head, a memory trying to break free, but it was as fleeting as smoke, disappearing the moment he tried to grasp it. Who was he? What had he lost? Without thinking, Darius moved toward the wreckage, his instincts kicking in. He wasn't sure what drove him forward: survival, curiosity, or something deeper. But the further he went, the more he felt like an outsider in his own body. He came across the remains of his team's equipment, scattered across the ground. Their weapons, their gear, all abandoned in haste. His stomach tightened. His fingers brushed against the charred remains of a rifle, its barrel twisted and broken. It was a reminder of a battle he could barely remember, but it felt too familiar. Suddenly, a distant sound broke through his thoughts. A low hum, growing louder. Darius tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon. His mind, still foggy, screamed at him that danger was near. Fight. Survive. He crouched behind a pile of debris, his heart racing as the hum grew closer. What was it? The last thing he remembered was facing off against the Galketh. Was it them? Were they back? A small, silent ship appeared overhead, descending slowly through the smoke-filled sky. Darius felt his muscles tighten, every fiber of his being on edge. The ship landed with a soft thud, its hatch opening. But as the figures emerged from the darkness, Darius froze. They were human. A small squad of soldiers, clad in the same military uniforms as his own team, stepped out. They were armed, cautious, but not hostile. And then one of them stepped forward, their helmet lifted to reveal a familiar face. It was a woman. Dark hair, strong features, but it was the eyes that stopped Darius in his tracks. The eyes that mirrored his own. It was his daughter. "Dad," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It's me, Lyra." Darius's breath caught in his throat. Lyra? The name felt like a distant echo. He could see the resemblance. The same eyes, the same fierce determination, but the memory was so faint. Who was this woman? Why did she look at him like that? His hand tightened on his weapon. Something deep inside told him to trust her, but everything about his instincts screamed that she was an enemy. She took a step forward. "Please, Dad, don't hurt me." For a brief moment, Darius hesitated. He looked at the weapon in his hand, the weight of it strange. The confusion in his mind swirled like a storm, and in the middle of it, the one thing he did know for sure was this. He had no idea who he was anymore. The cold wind howled through the ruined city, carrying with it the smell of dust and destruction. Darius stood still, his weapon still in his hand, as the figures in front of him seemed to blur. His daughter, Lyra, was standing just a few feet away, her face filled with worry and desperation. But to Darius, it was like looking at a stranger, someone he couldn't trust. The connection he once felt to her was gone, replaced by a deep, confusing emptiness. He had no memories, no past. The world around him was a blank slate, and every instinct screamed at him that he was being watched, that danger was closing in. But he couldn't remember why. "Dad, please," Lyra's voice trembled. "It's me. You have to remember." Her words cut through the fog in his mind, but they didn't reach him. He wasn't sure if she was lying to him, or if she really was who she said she was. The only thing he knew for certain was that he had no answers. "Stay back," Darius said, his voice flat and distant. He lifted his weapon, pointing it at her chest, his fingers cold against the trigger. He could hear the hum of his suit's HUD in his ears, but it didn't comfort him. Everything felt wrong. Who was this woman? Why did she call him Dad? Lyra didn't move. She just stared at him, her eyes wide with fear. You don't remember, do you? It's okay. I understand. The gas, it messed with your mind. But I'm here to bring you home, to bring you back to us. Home. The word echoed in his mind like a ghost, but it didn't mean anything. Where was home? Where was his family? And why did the thought of being home feel like a distant dream? Darius didn't lower his weapon. His training, his instincts, told him to stay alert, to watch for threats. Lyra could be a threat, or maybe it was the world around him that was the threat. He couldn't trust anything anymore. His suit's AI, Echo 9, spoke up, its voice calm but trying to reassure him. "Commander Voss, the woman in front of you is Captain Lyra Voss, your daughter. She is a trusted ally. You fought beside her in many battles." The words hit Darius like a jolt of electricity, but they didn't sink in. It was like trying to remember a dream you had forgotten the moment you woke up. His daughter. He had no memory of her, no memory of anything. He was a stranger to himself. Lyra. Darius whispered her name, testing it on his tongue. It felt wrong, like it belonged to someone else. The sound of another voice broke through the tension, a voice that was full of urgency. "Captain, we need to move. There's no time." One of the soldiers with Lyra spoke up, looking at her with concern. "We can't stay here. The Talketh will find us if we don't leave now." Lyra hesitated, looking back at her team. "We can't leave him like this," she said, her voice filled with pain. "He's our commander. He's my father. I can't just walk away." But the urgency in her voice was clear. The situation was dire, and they couldn't afford to waste time. Darius's mind was spinning. Zalketh. Who were they? Why were they a threat? Before Lyra could say more, a loud crash echoed through the ruined city. The ground shook beneath their feet, and the air filled with the sound of engines. The Talketh. They had found them. "Get down," shouted one of the soldiers, pulling Lyra behind cover. The world exploded into chaos. Explosions lit up the sky, sending debris flying in all directions. The Talketh had arrived in full force, their war machines descending from the sky, their soldiers already storming the ground. Darius didn't think. His body moved on its own, trained by years of combat experience. He crouched low, his weapon at the ready, scanning the surroundings. His mind was still foggy, but the need to protect himself, to survive, was stronger than ever. Fight. Survive. That was all he knew. "Dad." "No." Lyra's voice reached him, but Darius didn't hear it. He was already moving, sprinting toward the nearest Talketh soldier. His mind was still clouded, but his body remembered what to do. He leaped into the fray, his weapon firing without hesitation. The Talketh soldiers fell one by one as he cut through them with deadly precision. His movements were fluid, controlled, as if he were a part of the battlefield itself. But there was no joy in the kill, no satisfaction. It was just a mechanical response, a part of him he couldn't control. Lyra watched him from behind cover, her heart pounding in her chest. This wasn't the father she remembered. This wasn't the man who had once held her and promised to protect her. This was a soldier, a weapon, a ghost of the man she loved. Darius moved with ruthless efficiency, taking down every Talketh soldier that crossed his path. He was unstoppable, but there was a darkness to his movements. It was like he wasn't just fighting the aliens. He was fighting the ghosts in his own mind. Lyra knew that she had to do something, but she couldn't reach him. Not yet. "Dad, please," she shouted again, her voice filled with desperation. But Darius didn't hear her. His world was a battlefield, and there was only one rule: survive. The battle raged on, but amidst the chaos, there was a strange stillness in Lyra's heart. She couldn't tear her eyes away from her father, Darius Voss, the man who had raised her, the man she had looked up to as a hero. But now, as he fought alongside her team, he was a stranger. His eyes, once filled with warmth and wisdom, were now cold and distant. His movements were flawless, but there was no recognition in them. He wasn't fighting for her, for them. He was fighting for survival, for the battle itself. "Keep moving," Lyra shouted to her team, trying to keep them safe behind the ruined walls of a nearby building. The Talketh were everywhere, their war machines tearing through the city. Her squad was outnumbered, but she wasn't afraid. She had been in worse situations, and she had always believed that her father would come for her. But now he was fighting like an enemy. She could still see the uncertainty in his eyes, the confusion that lay beneath the soldier's instincts. He wasn't himself, but that didn't change the fact that he was still her father. She watched him move through the battlefield, dispatching the Talketh with ease, his rifle fired with deadly precision, each shot taking down a soldier. It was like watching a machine, not a man, a machine programmed to kill, to destroy. Lyra couldn't help but feel a deep ache in her chest. How had it come to this? "Lyra, you need to focus." One of her soldiers, Lieutenant Arlen, called out to her, his voice tense. "We don't have much time." She nodded, snapping back into action. The Xal'Keth were closing in on their position, and they needed to move quickly. The mission was clear: get Darius to safety, and then regroup with the rest of humanity. The war was over, but the danger was far from gone. There were still pockets of resistance, and the Xal'Keth weren't going to just leave. But that was easier said than done. "Dad," Lyra called out again, her voice rising above the gunfire. She saw him across the battlefield, taking down another Xal'Keth soldier. She could see the way he moved, the way he controlled the chaos around him. There was no hesitation, no fear. It was as if he was born for this moment, as if nothing else mattered but the fight. But in his eyes, she saw only emptiness. "He doesn't recognize me," Lyra thought, a wave of sorrow crashing over her. "I'm just another soldier to him now." For a moment, she wondered if he ever truly recognized her, even before the gas had taken his memories. She had always looked up to him, admired him. He had been everything to her, but now it felt like he was just a ghost of the man she remembered. "Lyra, we need to move," Arlen shouted, pulling her from her thoughts. "We're too exposed here." She glanced around, noticing the approaching Xal'Keth forces. They were already sending in more troops, more heavy artillery. Her team was outnumbered, and they couldn't afford to waste any more time. She turned back to Darius, her heart heavy with fear. How could she get through to him? The answer came as quickly as the thought itself. "Echo 9, activate the memory recall sequence," Lyra ordered, her voice firm. There was a brief pause before the AI responded. "Warning. Activating memory recall may result in temporary mental instability. Proceed with caution." "I don't have a choice," Lyra replied, her voice steady. "Do it." A series of beeps echoed in her ear as Echo 9 began its process. Lyra watched as her father moved through the battlefield, unaware of the impending change. His movements slowed for a moment, and for the first time since she had found him. There was a flicker in his eyes, a hesitation. It was working. Darius paused mid-fight, his rifle lowered for just a second. The fog in his mind seemed to lift, if only slightly. What was this? He turned, looking toward Lyra, and for a moment their eyes met. The world around them seemed to fade, the sounds of gunfire and explosions quieting in his mind. He remembered her. He remembered her. "Lyra." His voice was hoarse, the name coming out like a breath he didn't know he had been holding. You're my daughter." Lyra's heart raced. "Yes, Dad. It's me. I'm here. You're not alone." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she fought to keep them back. She had waited for this moment for what felt like an eternity, and now it was here. But the battle still raged on around them, and there was no time to celebrate. "Dad, we have to go. We need to move. Now," she urged, grabbing his arm. Darius blinked, his hand trembling as he looked down at her. His mind was still a mess of fog, but something was clear now. Something deep inside him told him that this was real, that she was real. I don't know what's happening," Darius said, his voice full of confusion. "I don't remember much, but I know you." He looked at her, his expression softening. "I remember you." A wave of relief washed over Lyra, but she didn't let her guard down. The Xal'Keth were still out there, and they weren't going to give up easily. She pulled him toward their escape route, her heart pounding in her chest. This was their chance. They couldn't waste it. But as they moved, Darius suddenly stopped, his eyes narrowing. "There's something else." Lyra turned, confused. "What do you mean?" "Danger," Darius muttered, his voice low. "They're coming. We're not alone." Before she could respond, a deep rumble shook the ground beneath them. Lyra turned just in time to see a massive Xal'Keth war machine appear on the horizon, its weapons aimed directly at them. The ground trembled beneath Lyra's feet as the massive Xal'Keth war machine loomed over them, its dark silhouette cutting through the smoky haze of the ruined city. Its weapons hummed with a deadly energy, and the air around them seemed to grow thick with the weight of its power. The sound of its engines was deafening, like the growl of a predator closing in on its prey. Lyra's heart raced as she pulled Darius behind the cover of a broken wall. His mind was still foggy, but the old soldier inside him was waking up, and she could feel it. This wasn't just a fight to survive anymore. This was a fight for everything. "We can't outrun that thing," Lyra said, her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to rise in her chest. "We need to find a way to fight back." Darius looked up at the war machine, his expression grim. "I know. We'll need more than just our weapons to take that down." The Xal'Keth war machine was unlike anything they had faced before. It was massive, towering above the city, with thick armor plating and weapon systems that could obliterate anything in their path. Lyra's mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. The war machine was too powerful for just their small team to take on. "We'll have to be smart," Darius said, his voice low but clear. He scanned their surroundings, taking in the broken buildings and the rubble. "We need to find a weakness, something we can use to our advantage." Lyra nodded, her eyes scanning the battlefield. The Xal'Keth had already begun to deploy soldiers, small skirmish units moving across the battlefield to secure the area. The war machine's main focus was on them, but the ground forces would soon close in as well. She had to act fast. "Arlen, take the team and create a diversion," Lyra ordered, her voice sharp with authority. "We'll lure them in and make them think they have the upper hand. Darius and I will find a way to hit that machine from the inside." Arlen, the lieutenant, nodded. "Understood, Captain." He waved to the rest of the squad, signaling them to move out. Lyra turned to Darius, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't lose him again. Not like this. They had fought side by side in the past, but now the stakes were different. She could see the struggle in his eyes. He was still trying to remember who he was, but right now, he was the only one who could help them win this fight. "Dad, we can do this," Lyra said, her voice firm. "You're not just a soldier. You're my father, and we'll get through this together." Darius looked at her, his gaze softening for a moment. "I don't remember everything, but I remember you. I'll follow your lead." Lyra's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and determination. She didn't need him to be the man he once was. She just needed him to be by her side. And together, they could face anything. As the team spread out to create the diversion, Lyra and Darius moved toward the Xal'Keth war machine. They knew they had to act quickly. Time was running out. The war machine's massive cannons hummed as they charged up, aimed directly at the cover they were hiding behind. Lyra knew they couldn't stay there much longer. The Xal'Keth were smart, and they would figure out their plans soon enough. "Stay low," Lyra whispered to Darius as they crouched behind the wreckage of a collapsed building. "We need to get closer." Darius nodded, his eyes narrowed with focus. His mind was still fragmented, but the old instincts were kicking in. He moved with precision, each step calculated. He might not remember everything, but the soldier inside him was still very much alive. The two of them crept through the ruins, using the broken buildings for cover. Lyra's heart raced as they drew closer to the war machine. It was massive, a towering presence on the battlefield. They were still a long way from reaching it, but Lyra had a plan. She had to. "We need to get inside," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "That machine has a weak point in its lower hull. If we can get close enough, we can plant explosives and take it down from the inside." Darius looked at her, his brow furrowed in thought. "How do you know that?" "I studied their designs," Lyra replied. "I know their tactics, their weaknesses. The Xal'Keth might be powerful, but they're not invincible." She was hoping that was true. They reached a narrow alleyway that led to the backside of the war machine. The sounds of battle were growing louder behind them, but they couldn't afford to look back. The Xal'Keth forces were closing in, and they had to move quickly. "We're almost there," Lyra said, her voice steady, though her mind was racing. "Once we plant the explosives, We need to get out fast. That machine will go up like a fireball." Darius nodded, his expression hardening. "We can do it." As they approached the war machine's lower hull, the ground beneath their feet shook with another blast from the Tsalketh's weapons. Lyra's heart skipped a beat, but she pushed forward. They were so close, just a few more steps, and they would be within reach. "Ready?" she asked, turning to Darius. He nodded, his gaze sharp. "Let's do it." With one last glance at the war machine, Lyra and Darius moved in, their steps quick and quiet. They reached the hull, and Lyra began planting the explosives. Her hands were steady despite the tension in her chest. This was their last chance. If they didn't succeed here, everything they had fought for would be lost. "Almost there," Lyra muttered, her fingers working quickly. Darius stood guard, watching for any sign of movement. The seconds ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. Then, just as Lyra placed the final charge, a loud roar echoed from behind them. The Tsalketh were closing in. The ground shook again as the Tsalketh forces closed in, their machines rumbling like thunder. Lyra's heart pounded in her chest as she set the last explosive charge on the war machine's lower hull. The timer was counting down, each second feeling heavier than the last. They had no time left. If they didn't get out now, they would be caught in the explosion. "Darius, it's done." Lyra called over her shoulder, her voice sharp with urgency. "We need to move now." Darius didn't need to be told twice. His instincts kicked in, and he pulled Lyra back into the shadows of a nearby wreckage. The Tsalketh forces were closer now, their soldiers marching in formation, unaware that they were about to become part of the explosion. Lyra could see the smoke rising from their path. Time was running out. "Is the charge set?" Darius asked, his voice low and calm, though she could see the tension in his eyes. "Set and ready," she replied, her voice steady despite the panic swirling in her chest. "We have 10 seconds. The countdown echoed in her mind, a constant reminder of how close they were to either victory or death. Lyra knew they didn't have much time. If they stayed too long, the blast would catch them. But if they moved too quickly, they wouldn't have enough time to escape the blast radius. "Get ready," Lyra whispered. The sounds of the Tsalketh soldiers' footsteps grew louder, and she could feel the heat of the approaching war machine. She peered over the wreckage, her eyes searching for the perfect moment. She couldn't afford to hesitate. Her mind raced, thinking of every possible outcome. The seconds ticked by like hours. Then, a loud clank echoed in the distance as the Tsalketh war machine's massive feet shifted, taking another step closer. Lyra's pulse quickened. They were too close. 5 seconds, she muttered to herself, keeping her voice low. Darius's hand gripped her shoulder, his gaze intense. He was ready. He had always been ready, even when his mind was a blank slate. He still had the heart of a soldier, the heart of her father. With the final 5 seconds counting down, Lyra took a deep breath and pulled Darius forward. She didn't need to say anything. He knew what to do. Together, they sprinted away from the war machine, weaving between the broken buildings and ruins. The sound of their footsteps was drowned out by the rumbling of the enemy's machines. Just as they turned a corner, a deafening explosion shook the ground beneath them. The air was filled with dust and debris as the Tsalketh war machine erupted in a fireball, its massive frame crumpling in on itself. The shockwave sent them both flying, knocking Lyra to the ground. She gasped for air, her head spinning, but she forced herself to stand, her eyes scanning the chaos around her. "Darius," she shouted, her voice rising above the noise. She reached out and grabbed his hand, pulling him up from the ground. He was dazed, his eyes unfocused for a moment, but he shook his head and blinked the confusion away. "We did it," he said, his voice hoarse but filled with relief. "It's over." Lyra looked back at the war machine, now a twisted mass of smoldering metal and flames. The Tsalketh forces had been caught off guard by the blast, their soldiers scrambling in confusion as the remnants of their machine crumpled into the dirt. But the battle was far from over. "Not yet," Lyra said, her voice hardening. "We've won this round. But there's still more to fight." Darius looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "We can't stay here. The Xal'Keth won't let this go." Lyra nodded. She had always known that. The Xal'Keth would regroup. They were relentless, but they were also smart. They would adapt, they would counter, and they would come for them. "We need to get to the evac point," Lyra said, already turning toward the direction they had planned to take. "It's the only way out of here." Darius followed her, his movements steady. Though his memories were still scattered, he didn't hesitate. He trusted her. She was his daughter, and she had been raised on the same battlefield he had once stood on. Together, they had faced the worst the universe had to offer. The city was in ruins, but it was still their home, and they would fight for it. As they moved through the streets, the Xal'Keth regrouped, their forces closing in on their position. Lyra could see the shapes of their warships in the distance, their massive forms cutting through the smoky sky. The enemy was coming, and they would soon be here in full force. "We don't have much time," Lyra said, her voice urgent. "We need to get out before they lock this area down." Darius nodded. His mind was still foggy, but his instincts had never failed him. He knew the way. They had been trained to survive. But survival wasn't enough. They needed to get to the evac point. They had to reach the last ship that could get them off this planet before it was too late. Lyra didn't know if they would make it. The Xal'Keth had cut off most of the escape routes. But she wasn't going to give up. Not now. Not ever. "Keep moving," Lyra ordered, her voice firm. "We're not done yet." The world around them was in flames, but their mission was clear. They had come this far. They would keep going, because that's what soldiers did. That's what families did. They fought. They survived. And they never stopped. Lyra's boots hit the ground with a soft thud as she and Darius moved through the shattered streets. The air was thick with smoke, and the acrid scent of burning metal filled her nostrils. The once thriving city had been reduced to a wasteland, the remains of buildings strewn across the streets like broken bones. The Xal'Keth were relentless, and they had turned everything to ash. But Lyra wouldn't stop. She couldn't. Not now, not when they were so close to reaching the evac point. Every step they took brought them closer to the last hope for survival. Their chances were slim, but as long as they were alive, there was still a chance. Darius moved beside her, his footsteps slow but steady. She could see the strain in his eyes, the confusion that still clouded his mind. He had come so far from the man he once was, but something deep inside him hadn't changed. He was still her father, and that meant more than anything. "We're almost there," Lyra said, trying to keep her voice steady. Her eyes flicked to the horizon, where the evac ship was supposed to be waiting. It was their only way off this planet, and the only chance they had to escape the Xal'Keth forces. But the closer they got, the more dangerous it became. The enemy was everywhere. Lyra could hear the hum of their machines in the distance, and she knew they weren't far behind. The Xal'Keth had a way of appearing out of nowhere, and their numbers were vast. It wouldn't be long before they realized where Lyra and Darius were headed. "I know," Darius said, his voice hoarse. He paused, looking around at the ruins. "But I don't know how much longer we can keep running." Lyra glanced at him, her heart heavy. She knew what he meant. They had been running for what felt like forever, and the longer they stayed in the open, the more likely they were to be caught. The Xal'Keth wouldn't stop until they had wiped out every last human on the planet. "We don't have a choice," Lyra replied, her voice firm. "We keep moving, no matter what." Darius didn't say anything, but he nodded. They both knew the stakes. There was no turning back now. They pressed on, weaving through the narrow streets and ruined buildings. The sounds of battle still echoed in the distance, but the world around them felt eerily silent. It was as if the entire planet had already been claimed by the enemy, and they were the last survivors. Lyra's mind raced. She knew they were close, but she also knew the Xal'Keth were closing in on them. The evac point was just ahead, but it might as well have been 100 miles away. Every step felt like a lifetime. "We can make it," Lyra said, more to herself than to Darius. "We just have to keep going." But even as she said the words, a loud crash echoed through the air. The ground shook beneath their feet, and a cloud of dust erupted from a nearby building. Lyra's heart skipped a beat as she spun around, her pulse racing. The Xal'Keth had found them. A group of enemy soldiers appeared from the rubble, their weapons raised and ready. They were moving in fast, their eyes locked on Lyra and Darius. "Stay down," Lyra shouted, grabbing Darius by the arm and pulling him behind a broken wall. They couldn't outrun them, but they could still fight. The Xal'Keth soldiers advanced, their armored boots crunching on the broken ground. Lyra's hand tightened around her weapon, her finger hovering over the trigger. She didn't have time to think. She just had to act. "Darius, stay here," she ordered, her voice low and urgent. "I'll take them out." "No, Lyra," Darius said, his voice firm despite the confusion in his eyes. "I'm not leaving you." Lyra hesitated for a moment, looking into her father's eyes. She could see the strength there, the soldier that still lived inside him. Even though he didn't remember everything, he still had the heart of a warrior. "All right," she said, her voice tight. "But stay close." With that, they both stepped out from behind the wall and fired at the oncoming Xal'Keth soldiers. The sound of gunfire echoed through the streets, and the enemy soldiers quickly took cover. Lyra and Darius moved in sync, their training kicking in. They knew what they had to do. The Xal'Keth soldiers returned fire, their weapons crackling with energy. Lyra dodged behind another broken wall, her heart pounding in her chest. She peeked around the corner, trying to get a clear shot. There were too many of them, and their weapons were too powerful. They couldn't keep fighting like this. "We have to move," Lyra shouted to Darius, her voice filled with urgency. "We can't win this fight. We need to get to the evac point." Darius nodded, his eyes narrowed in determination. He raised his weapon, firing at the enemy soldiers to cover their retreat. Lyra grabbed his arm and pulled him forward, running as fast as she could. The Xal'Keth soldiers were right behind them, their weapons firing in quick bursts. The streets were filled with smoke and dust, and Lyra could barely see where she was going. But she kept running, one foot in front of the other, pushing through the pain and exhaustion. They were so close. The evac point was just ahead, and she could see the outline of the ship in the distance. "We're almost there," she yelled, her voice filled with hope. But as they turned the corner, a massive explosion rocked the ground. Lyra and Darius were thrown to the ground by the force of the blast. The world spun around her, and her vision blurred. She blinked, trying to focus, but all she could hear was the ringing in her ears. The evac ship was gone. The Xal'Keth had destroyed it. The shock of the explosion still lingered in the air as Lyra struggled to sit up. Her head throbbed, and her vision swam as she tried to regain her bearings. The ground beneath her was rough, the rubble and dust clouding her senses. Her heart pounded in her chest, louder than the ringing in her ears. "Darius," she groaned, her voice barely a whisper. Her eyes darted to the side, and she saw him lying beside her, still and motionless. Panic surged through her. She reached out, her hand trembling, but when she touched his shoulder, he groaned, slowly stirring. "Dad?" Lyra's voice cracked as she gently shook him. "Dad, wake up." He opened his eyes, blinking a few times as if struggling to remember where he was, his brow furrowed, confusion still clouding his features. "Lyra?" Darius asked, his voice hoarse and thick with disorientation. "What happened? Where are we?" Lyra helped him sit up, taking a deep breath. "We're still here, but the evac ship, it's gone. The Xal'Keth destroyed it." Darius looked around, his gaze searching the ruined landscape. The smoke from the explosion was still rising into the air, darkening the sky. The city was nothing but a hollow shell now. The once beautiful skyline was reduced to twisted metal and crumbling stone. And the sound of the Xal'Keth forces could be heard, getting closer with every passing second. Lyra's heart sank, but she didn't allow herself to feel defeated. They had come this far, and they couldn't give up now. She looked around, trying to see if there was any way out. Their best chance of survival was to keep moving. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of their situation. "The Xal'Keth will be here any minute." Darius nodded, slowly pushing himself to his feet with Lyra's help. His movements were still stiff, his mind clearly not as sharp as it should have been, but he was trying. He always tried. "Where do we go now?" Darius asked, his voice full of concern. "We've lost everything." Lyra took a deep breath, forcing herself to think through the chaos. There had to be another way out, another plan. She refused to accept that this was the end. "There's a hidden bunker," she said after a moment. "It's not far from here. If we can make it there, we can regroup, find a way to get back at the Xal'Keth. There's still hope." Darius hesitated, but then nodded, his gaze steady. "Lead the way." They began to move, stepping carefully through the debris, avoiding the exposed areas where the enemy might be patrolling. Lyra kept her senses sharp, every step bringing them closer to the hidden bunker. The war-torn streets felt empty, yet full of danger. She could sense the Xal'Keth closing in, their relentless pursuit threatening to overrun them at any moment. Lyra's mind raced as she led Darius down a narrow alley. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the Avex ship, the last shred of hope that had been shattered in an instant. It had been their way out, their escape from the planet's fall. Now they were stranded with only one option: to keep fighting. "We'll make it," Lyra muttered to herself, more to reassure herself than anything. "We have to." The buildings around them were in ruins, but Lyra knew this part of the city well. She had trained in its depths during the early days of the war, learning every hidden passage, every secret route. The bunker she was heading for had been built as a last line of defense, a place for soldiers to retreat and regroup. She hoped it was still intact. As they rounded a corner, Lyra saw the entrance to the bunker up ahead. It was a hidden door, cleverly concealed among the rubble. She couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. They weren't finished yet. "There it is," Lyra said, pointing to the entrance. "That's our way in." Darius nodded, and together they hurried toward the door. The closer they got, the more the air seemed to grow heavy, as if the world itself was holding its breath. When they reached the door, Lyra quickly checked the security codes. The old system was still working, but only just. With a quick swipe of her wristband, the door slid open with a low hiss. They slipped inside, the heavy door closing behind them with a dull thud. Inside, the bunker was dark and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. Lyra's eyes adjusted to the dim light as she looked around. The room was filled with supplies, weapons, medical kits, and emergency rations. It was a safe haven for soldiers who needed to regroup, and it would serve as their refuge for now. "We're safe," Lyra said, letting out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Darius sank down onto a nearby bench, rubbing his face with his hands. He looked worn, tired, but there was still a fire in his eyes. "For now," he said quietly. "But what comes next?" Lyra moved to the control panel in the corner of the room, activating the communication system. The screen flickered to life, revealing a static-filled image of a soldier she didn't recognize. "This is Captain Lyra," she said, her voice steady. "Is anyone out there? We need backup." The soldier on the screen nodded, though the connection was weak. "We hear you, Captain. There's a rescue team on its way. Hold tight." Relief washed over Lyra, but she knew they couldn't let their guard down yet. The Xal'Keth were still out there, and their pursuit wasn't over. But for the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was a glimmer of hope. "We're not done yet," Lyra said, looking at Darius. "We keep fighting, no matter what." Darius met her gaze, his eyes full of determination. "Together, we fight, and we survive."